I wonder how many men have been killed with this gun. I also wonder how many men have used this gun to kill. Welcome to part 2 of our trip to South Carolina. In the last episode, we talked about the Caw Interpretive Center and told the story of the Stono Rebellion of 1739 from the instigator Jemmy's point of view. Then we went on and told the story of the Chapel of Ease, this time from the viewpoint of Captain William Oliver Perry Fripp. If you did not see that, click the link above. In today's video, we will be telling some stories of things that happened at the Marine Corps Recruit Depot on Parris Island, South Carolina. We had to visit that site, mainly because one of us, not me, is an Air Force veteran. We drove around for a bit, looking at the place with its lush greenery and well-designed grounds, and it was a treat indeed. But our main focus was to visit the Parris Island Museum. We parked in the visitors' parking lot and immediately saw on the building the names and years of the wars, not to mention that cannon on the front lawn. As we strolled through history here and did our research, we found as usual some inspirational stories, but girls and boys, we found some really heartbreaking ones as well. Hey there, if you're into fascinating stories like these, then you've definitely landed in the right spot. Our channel takes you on a journey across the United States and even beyond in search of authentic and mind-blowing stories. I often delve into the minds of my characters and share their perspectives with you. All these are true stories. Now buckle up and get ready for some captivating storytelling. There is so much to share in this part 2. I have 3 very interesting stories for you. So I will not waste any more time here blabbering. But if at any time during this video you feel the need to like this video and subscribe, please do so. That would mean the world to me. I am your host, LT Bartek. Located on Parris Island, comeback recruits undergo intensive training, but unfortunately, some drill sergeants push their trainees beyond the limits, sometimes resulting in fatalities. The island spans 4 miles in length and 3 miles in width, encompassing a total of 8,047 acres, out of which only 3,274 acres are dry land. The remaining land is treacherous swamp terrain, which poses severe threats, as you'll soon discover. The first story I want to highlight is one that is very troubling. So without further delay, walk with us as we stroll around the museum while I tell you about this true story that happened here. Staff Sergeant Matthew McKeon finished his lunch, which he followed up with a couple of beers. Having finished, he got up from the table and walked over to dump his trash in the receptacle. He straightened his shirt and adjusted his tie. He had an image to uphold as a drill instructor here on Parris Island. He expected much from his recruits and knew he should always set an example. He walked over to the exit and pulled open the door. Walking out into the bright noonday sunlight, he stopped for a second to pull his hat down to shield his eyes from the blinding glare of the sun. With authority and pride attained from his tours of both World War II and the Korean War, he walked towards his barracks, walking tall as he went about his duties. It was April 8th, 1958, and he was so goddamn tired of the antics of his 74 recruits They had been so bad that he needed to give them a little taste of a hard time. That was why he needed the liquid courage to do what he must. He was not a stern man before coming to the military, but he had to be, especially to his recruits, new and past. He had a responsibility to make them tough. War was tough. If you didn't get them there as a drill sergeant, you might as well kill them right now, or send them home to their mommies and daddies. But the military needed them, and they were willing. So it was up to him to make them into soldiers, fighting machines, weapons of war. Sergeant McKeon waited until dark, just to give them time to think all was well, and then he stormed in. They jumped to attention and he barked his orders. Lickety-split, all 74 recruits were lined up in front of him, dressed, and he looked at them, some with sleep still in their eyes. He forced himself to become the feared drill sergeant they had grown to hate. Starting from one end of the line, he cussed at them. "You sorry lump of coals, you bunch of lint lickers, we're going for a nice stroll on the beach." He continued to degrade them, then at his command they marched off into the darkness in the direction of Robin Creek. Staff Sergeant Matthew McKeon entered the creek first and then had them join him to perform some exercise there. Nighttime exercise and night marches in Robin Creek were common exercises, and this had been done by other drill sergeants in the past. But things got out of hand pretty quickly. His recruits started goofing off, breaking formation, and playing around in the water near the swamp. As they marched along the creek bed, many of them wandered into deep water. Ahead of the 74 men, McKeon didn't hear the screams until it was too late. By the time he ran back to see what the commotion was, 6 of his recruits drowned. Dead were Private Thomas Curtis Hardeman, Private First Class Donald Francis O'Shea, Private Charles Francis Riley, Private Jerry Lamont Thomas, Private Leroy Thompson, and Private Norman Alfred Wood. After the Robin Creek tragedy, a court of inquiry charged Staff Sergeant Matthew McKeon with a bunch of stuff, like having booze on the base, being a bad boss to his troops, and even involuntary manslaughter and negligent homicide. They even said he was drunk in front of the recruits. While it was true that McKeon had been drinking the day before the exercise, he wasn't drunk when he took the platoon out to the creek. A doctor even testified later at his trial that McKeon wasn't drunk. The court recommended that McKeon be court-martialed, and he was. People were really upset about the whole thing though, and there was much backlash against Marine Corps training, but plenty of Marines spoke out in McKeon's defense. One of his supervisors, Staff Sergeant E.H. Huff, even testified that McKeon was an excellent drill instructor and that night marches were totally normal. In fact, he said his own platoon was so poorly behaved that he would have taken them on the march himself if he had time. McKeon was defended by a group of volunteer lawyers from New York, including his brother-in-law Thomas P. Costello, Emily Zola Berman, and Howard Lester, along with Marine Corps attorney Lieutenant Colonel Alaric W. Valentin, Major John R. DeBar, and Lieutenant Collins. Berman led the team. In court, Berman asked General Louis Chesty Puller to speak about the training methods used in the Marine Corps. General Puller acknowledged that the Ribbon Creek incident was terrible, but did not believe that McKeon deserved a court-martial. He emphasized that discipline was a vital aspect of military training and quoted Napoleon to support his statement. He also mentioned his own experience during the Korean War and how a lack of night training had led to failures. General Puller thought that the press had overreacted because of their bias against the Marine Corps. He cited a similar incident at an army post where 10 soldiers drowned, but their superiors were not charged, and the incident never made the headlines as Ribbon Creek did. In the end, Staff Sergeant McKeon was acquitted of manslaughter and oppression of his troops, but was found guilty of negligent homicide and drinking on duty. But that wasn't the only death at Parris Island during training. Staff Sergeant Stephen T. Smiley was charged with 1 count of negligent homicide, 1 count of obstruction of justice, 1 count of cruelty, oppression, or maltreatment of subordinates, and another count with 4 specifications of failure to obey orders in June of 2021. This crime was committed against Private First Class Dalton Beals. Private First Class Dalton Beals died as a result of extreme body temperature while completing the culminating boot camp training event, the Crucible, in 90+ degree temperatures. The Crucible is a rigorous 54-hour event designed to test and validate the skills and training of Marine recruits before they earn the title of Marines. During this intense experience, recruits are divided into squads and must work together to overcome a variety of obstacles that require both physical and mental toughness. The challenges they face are designed to promote teamwork and camaraderie and to prepare them for the demanding task they will face as Marines. It is said that Beals' death could have been avoided because training could have been altered due to the high temperatures. Added to that, Smiley was not adequately overseeing his troops and was also giving them extra physical training which was not suited for that type of weather. According to the investigative report, Smiley was found to be technically qualified as a senior drill instructor but lacked the necessary leadership skills, temperament, and maturity to perform his duties in that role effectively. Now for my main story. It's about the Honorable Robert Smalls. The Honorable Robert Smalls was born on April 5, 1839 in Beaufort, South Carolina. He died at the age of 75 in Beaufort on February 23, 1915. Here is one of his most remarkable feats. Robert Smalls sat at the small rickety board chair beside his wife Anna Lee Jones in front of the slave owner who owned her. He had finally saved up $100 to buy her freedom, but his excitement and hope were shattered like glass that had been thrown at a brick wall when her owner told him that the price of his beloved's freedom was $800. He had worked hard day and night to get this money, and his heart sank knowing that it would take years before he could save up enough for her freedom. He implored her slave master to take what he had, but was sternly told no. Holding the now hand of the sobbing Hannah, they left the office as if in a daze. "Don't worry, Hannah. I will free you and the children, even if it's the last thing I do," he told her, doing his best to reassure her, hoping to stop her tears. Robert was 17 at the time and Anna was 22 when he married her on December 24, 1856. She had come into his life with 2 girls of her own. Early in the year, in February, she had given him his first child, a girl, Elizabeth Lydia Smalls. It would be 3 years later that he would get his son, but that child would be dead after 2 years on this earth. Since the age of 12, when he was hired out as a laborer by a slave owner to a hotel earning $16 an hour, where he was only allowed to keep $1 as payment, Robert was a hard worker and impressed whomever he worked for because he was smart and a quick learner. This was evident when he went from working in the hotel to transitioning to street lamplighter. Robert loved the sea, and one would see him just standing on the shore looking out into the distance, hoping he would one day get to be out there in the vast openness. Robert's dream was soon realized when he got a job working on the docks at Charleston on the wharfs as a longshoreman. A longshoreman is a labor-intensive job that involves loading and unloading ships, trucks, and trains at the waterfront. Soon he was the wheelman, aka helmsman, steering the ship around Charleston Harbor, becoming very familiar with the territory. In April of 1861, the Civil War, the Battle of Fort Sumter, came to Charleston Harbor. Because he was an avid wheelman, he was given the task of steering the CSS Planter for the Confederate Army, piloting the Planter throughout Charleston Harbor and area rivers along South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. The duty of those on the CSS Planter was to lay mines and deliver dispatches, troops, and supplies. Robert was excellent at what he did, and soon he gained the confidence of the captain and the crew of the Planter. Knowing this, he began to plan his escape in April 1862 as a way to gain the freedom of his family and fellow black shipmates. On May 12, 1862, the Planter docked at Coles Island, a Confederate post southwest of Charleston on the Stono River. They loaded 4 large guns, 200 pounds of ammunition, and 20 cords of firewood onto the Planter from the Confederate post that was about to be dismantled. A cord is a unit of measurement of dry volume used to measure firewood and pulpwood in the United States and Canada. As per usual, the white officers would go ashore come evening to find entertainment. Knowing this, Robert made his plan for that very time. Just before the officers left, Smalls walked up to Captain Relea and asked nonchalantly if his and the rest of the black crew's family members could come on board for a brief visit. Permission was granted, with Relea warning that they should disembark before curfew. Not having told everyone except a trusted few what his plan was, when the rest of the men and families heard about his escape plan to freedom, they adamantly refused to go along with it for fear of death. But Robert assured them that all would be well and to trust him. Finally, they decided to go along with it, knowing that if they pulled this off, it would mean freedom from slavery and being beaten in the cotton fields. With that done, Robert asked 3 of his black crew members to pretend to escort the families off the boat and home, when in fact, they were instructed to take and hide the families aboard another steamer that was docked at the North Atlantic Wharf. At about 3 a.m. on the morning of May 13th, Smalls entered the captain's quarters and pulled on one of the captain's uniforms. He had to make something to look like a captain's hat, being that there was only one and the captain was wearing it. So he fashioned the hat out of straws, and in the dark, one could not tell the difference. Robert sailed the CSS Planter as confidently as the captain would, stopping at the southern wharf to pick up his wife and children and the rest of his fellow black crew members' families. Though his heart was beating out of his chest, he guided the ship past 5 Confederate harbor forts, giving them the correct steam whistle signals at each checkpoint. He had studied the captain's body movement and made the usual gestures as he passed. The last and most heavily armored Confederate fort was Fort Sumter, and Robert hoped that his already heavily beating heart would not burst out of his chest. His knees felt weak, and though this early in the morning was cool, he was sweating profusely. Feeling sick, he leaned against the helm for support. He was not sure if this whole plan would end there, and if his actions would cause the fort to fire on them, killing everyone. He steeled himself to be strong for his family and his fellow crewmate and their families, and he continued to steer the ship towards the fort. He could hear the women and children's soft sobs and prayers as they prayed to God for help. A couple of the men urged him to steer away from the land, but he refused because he knew that would be suspicious, so he stayed on course, sailing slowly as if this was just another Tuesday. Just then, the Fort Sumter flashed the challenge signal, and Small gave the correct hand signals. After a long pause, with Small's bladder threatening to explode right there on deck, Fort Sumter signaled all was well. But for Fort Sumter, all was not well. For instead of heading towards Morris Island, the CSS Planner continued straight towards the Union Navy fleet, the USS Onward. But by the time they realized what was happening, the planter was out of firing range. Small quickly told them to hoist the white sheet his wife had brought as a sign of surrender, and it was good that they did that because the USS Onward was about to fire when they saw the white sheet sailing in the wind. Though they could not call a black man a hero at that time, the Union officers held Small in high regards, because not only had he brought all the ammunition from the Confederates to them, but he had also given them the Captain Code book containing the captain's signal and a map of the mines and torpedoes that had been laid in the Charleston harbor. The information he gave them was so valuable that it was instrumental in the capture of Coles Island and its string of batteries without a fight 1 week after Small's escape. In the end, all who escaped became free men and women. I have to stop here for now, but there is so much out there about this remarkable man, and I do hope you find the time to read about him. But before I go, here are some additional facts about Parris Island. Settlers have been trying to colonize Parris Island since 1526 all the way through to 1722. First was the French in 1562, then the Spaniards, and then the British. Parris Island was used to cultivate cotton, as we talked about in part 1 of this series. This was started after the Revolutionary War. The Union Navy used Parris Island as a coaling station during the Civil War. On November 2, 1861, the first Marines in the area of Parris Island sailed into Port Royal Harbor, South Carolina. In order to safeguard the government's interest during the construction process, a team of Marines comprising of 1 sergeant, 2 corporals, and 10 privates were deployed to Port Royal. This marked the inception of the first ever Marine post on the island. However, providing appropriate accommodations for the guard was a tardy affair, and the barracks being made available to them almost 2 years later. April 6, 1917 to November 11, 1918, during World War I, the recruit depot really beefed up, with tons of new facilities and more Marines being trained to meet the demands of the war effort. They even started giving recruits different kinds of training, plus they changed the name of Marine Barracks in Port Royal to Marine Barracks in Parris Island. and the government took over the last of the private land there. And get this, they officially changed the name to Parris, Parris, with Marine Corps Order number 32 on May 3rd, 1919. On February 28, 1949, the first female recruits arrived at Parris Island to start training as women Marines. This was only possible because of the Women's Armed Services Integration Act of 1948, which allowed women to serve in the military. Even now, Parris Island is still the only recruit depot that trains female enlist Marines. And that's not all. African Americans recruits who had been training at Montfort Point near Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, were also moved to Parris Island that same year. Between June 25, 1950 and July 27, 1953, just 3 years, approximately 138,000 Marines graduated from Parris Island. Also, between 1962 and 1973, more than 200,000 recruits trained at Parris Island during the Vietnam War. Now that we have come to the end of my stories, I hope you enjoyed them. If so, give this video a like and share it with someone you think will find it interesting as well. And if you want to come with me on the next trip, click the subscribe button and select all. Doing that guarantees you as one of my travel companions. Also, comment if you have ever been to Parris Island and tell me what you thought of it, or even if you've been to South Carolina, what did you think of it? Now, if you only want to listen to this story and all my other stories, I have that for you in my podcast of the same name. You will find the link in my description below. Don't forget to check out my books on Amazon, Kindle Vella, Google Play Books, Wattpad, and others. And if you want to support this channel and help me get to more places to find you lots more stories, I have a Patreon link below for that. Well, that is all for now, folks. Remember to love yourself and others. Stay tuned for the next weekly videos. Be good to yourself and others, and I'll catch you on the next one. Love you. Bye.